It was one of those mornings when the sky seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken stories. The rain fell steady, quiet, not in torrents, but in the kind of rhythm that made people walk faster, speak softer, and look away from one another. Inside a small coffee shop tucked in the corner of 7th and Lexer, life moved as usual. Steam hissed from the espresso machine. The scent of dark roast mingled with rain-soaked pavement. A flickering open sign buzzed softly in the window, and no one paid much attention when the door creaked open and a stranger stepped in. He looked out of place, not in an obvious way, not with dramatic contrast, just not quite right. His coat clung to him, too thin for the cold. Shoes worn down at the heels. Hair peppered with gray, plastered damp across his forehead. He walked like someone trying not to take up space. As he reached the counter, he glanced at the chalkboard menu, the prices, the options, and then looked at the girl behind the register. She couldn't have been more than 30. Her name tag read Hannah. "Just a plain coffee, please," he said, voice barely above the hum of the shop. Hannah smiled politely and began to ring it up. "That'll be $3.50. The man nodded, then reached into his pockets. Left, right, jacket, jeans again. His fingers moved faster, less precise, more desperate. His expression changed from calm to confused, then from confused to panicked. I must have left it," he mumbled. "My wallet. The boy next to Hannah, an assistant barista named Troy, rolled his eyes and leaned closer. "If you don't have the money," he said loud enough for the nearest tables to hear, "this isn't a free lounge, man. You can't just hang around here." Hannah opened her mouth, hesitated. The man shrank inward, his shoulders folding under invisible weight. "I wasn't trying to get a free drink. It's cold. I needed somewhere dry to sit." A laugh came from the corner booth. A pair of men in suits, watching. One of them smirked. "They really do show up anywhere now, huh? Next thing you know, he'll be asking for a latte and Wi-Fi," the other added, raising his voice like cruelty was a joke. The man took a step back. "It's fine," he whispered. "I'll go." And maybe that would have been it. Just another moment of humiliation, another small cruelty unnoticed by the world. But Hannah moved. She didn't shout. She didn't make a scene. She simply reached into her apron pocket, pulled out a crumpled $5 bill, and placed it on the counter. "I'll cover it," she said quietly. Troy scoffed. "Seriously? You don't even know this guy?" "I don't need to," she replied, then turned to the man. "Please sit. I'll bring it over." He paused, just for a second. His eyes, dull with exhaustion, flickered. Not with hope. Not yet, but something close. Hannah delivered the coffee a minute later, placing it on the table by the window. No fanfare. No lecture. Just kindness. "Don't worry about what they said," she told him. "You deserve to be here as much as anyone." He nodded slowly. "Thank you, you didn't have to." "I know," she smiled gently. "That's why I did." That night, Hannah walked home in the rain. Her shoes soaked through, her coat too thin. She lived in a one-bedroom apartment she shared with her younger brother, Caleb, who had a fever and couldn't go to school. She reheated rice and canned soup, fed him, held his hand as he slept. In her wallet, $1.82, a bus pass, and a photo of their mom from before she passed. Still, she didn't regret that coffee, not for a second. And somewhere across the city, in a room with floor-to-ceiling windows and walls lined with books and silence, the man she had helped sat in dry clothes now, sipping the memory of a warm cup, replaying her words. Because what Hannah didn't know was that this man wasn't who he seemed. He wasn't homeless. He wasn't desperate. He wasn't ordinary. He was Mason Halberg, billionaire, founder of Halberg Global, a man who once sat atop the Forbes list, then vanished from the spotlight. No interviews, no photos, no headlines, just whispers. And now he was here, looking for something he'd stopped believing existed. A reason to trust again, a reason to feel seen. He hadn't come to test anyone, but in that small coffee shop, on that rainy morning, he'd found what he hadn't dared hope to see again: compassion without condition. And it moved something in him, something that had been asleep for far too long. 3 days passed. Hannah returned to her routines: early shifts, long nights, cold walks home. The coffee shop was the same. The rain still came and went, and though no one said it aloud, something had shifted in the air. Her coworkers spoke in quieter tones. Customers glanced at her longer than usual. Some avoided eye contact altogether. No one mentioned what happened that rainy morning, but the silence around it was loud. Hannah didn't regret what she did. She regretted how alone it made her feel afterward. Her manager, Rob, had pulled her aside the next day. "You can't just give out drinks to people like that," he said, arms crossed over his stained apron. "This is a business." "I paid for it," she replied simply. "That's not the point," Rob barked. "You embarrassed staff. You made customers uncomfortable. This isn't some charity kitchen." Hannah didn't argue. She just looked at him, level and steady. "Maybe it should be," she said quietly. She was sent to clean the restrooms for the rest of the shift. That night, Caleb had another coughing fit. The medicine was nearly gone. Rent was coming due. Hannah sat by the window, watching the streetlights blur behind the rain, clutching the last few crumpled bills in her wallet. And yet, she still wouldn't take back what she did, because she remembered something her mother used to tell her, back when life was simpler, before hospitals and overdue bills and whispered grief. "You never know who needs you," her mother said once, "until you choose to care without asking why." That morning, she had done just that. And then, on the 4th day, the doorbell above the coffee shop chimed again. The noise didn't register at first. It was busy. Steam rose from mugs. Jazz hummed low in the background. Conversations filled the space. But something changed. A stillness. A shift in breath, in attention. Customers paused mid-sentence. The rhythm of the room softened like a held breath. Hannah glanced up, just briefly, and froze. The man who had once stood there drenched and invisible now returned, but not as a shadow of himself. This time he stood tall, dry, dressed in a charcoal gray coat that looked like it came from another world entirely. His hair was neatly combed. A silk scarf looped around his neck. His presence didn't ask for attention. It simply had it. He didn't walk to the counter. He walked to the window seat, the same one, and sat. Hannah felt her hands tremble slightly. She moved on instinct, picking up a menu, walking over to him, unsure what to say, unsure what this was. "Would you like?" "I'm not here to order," he said gently. She hesitated, lowered the menu. "I only have one question," he added. She waited. "Why did you help me?" She blinked. She began, unsure of how to explain something that hadn't felt like a decision at all. "You didn't look like someone asking for a handout. You looked like someone being made to feel small, and I know what that feels like." He nodded slowly, then gestured to the seat across from him. She sat. "When I was 17, she said softly, my mother collapsed in a grocery store. People walked around us like we didn't exist. Only one woman stopped. An old woman with nothing in her cart but a half-dozen eggs and bruised apples. She stayed. She gave me her shawl. She stayed until help came. I never forgot that." She looked out the window. "So when I saw you, there was no decision. I just remembered." The man listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't look away. He just listened. After a long pause, he said, "Do you read?" The question caught her off guard. "Books?" she asked. He nodded. "I used to," she said. "Not much lately. But I always liked stories about ordinary people doing something brave. Quietly brave." He smiled faintly. "Good choice." What followed wasn't planned. They talked. About books, about music, about why people grow cruel when they feel powerless. He mentioned composers Hannah had never heard of. She asked questions without pretending to know. He answered with patience, not ego. Time slipped away. At one point, she laughed, really laughed for the first time in weeks. "You're not what I expected," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "What did you expect?" "Someone who wanted to say thank you and disappear." He looked down, then back at her. "I've had wealth for a long time," he said, "but very few people have made me feel human. That day, you did." And there it was, the quiet truth, placed on the table like a fragile gift. Hannah didn't say anything. She didn't need to, because in that moment, they weren't waitress and billionaire. They weren't giver and receiver. They were just two people, finally seen. Exactly 1 week later, Hannah came home to find a cream-colored envelope slipped under her door. No name on the front, just her address written in looping cursive. Inside was a card, thick and expensive. Her name was printed at the top, Hannah L. Clark, guest of Mason A. Halberg. The logo embossed in gold below was unmistakable. The Orion, a 5-star hotel known more for hosting diplomats than waitresses, with part-time shifts. She stared at the card for a long time. the handwritten note tucked inside. It simply read, "I'd like to talk." No expectations, just conversation. You gave me more than a coffee. You gave me a reason to ask again. M. She almost didn't go. But 3 nights later, she stood in the lobby of the Orion, wearing her best blouse, shoes borrowed from a neighbor, hair tied back, trembling fingers tucked into her coat sleeves. She took the elevator to the 21st floor, was shown to a private lounge that overlooked the skyline. He was already there, different again, not just dressed well, but composed in a way that made her feel like she had stepped into a different orbit. He rose when she entered, offered her tea, a seat. "Thank you for coming," he said. "This isn't exactly my usual coffee shop," she joked, voice a little too quiet. He smiled. "No, it's not." They sat, and then Mason told her everything. His name, his company, his loss. His wife had passed away 15 years ago. Cancer, sudden. He had never remarried, never had children. Since then, he'd spent years traveling anonymously, walking through towns, sitting in parks, stopping in coffee shops dressed in simple clothes, watching, waiting, not for someone to impress him, for someone to see him. That morning in the cafe, Hannah had done exactly that. And not because he looked rich, or worthy, or important, but because he didn't. That, he said, was what changed everything. Hannah sat in silence. "You set me up," she said eventually. Her voice didn't rise. It just trembled slightly. "No," he replied gently. "I didn't plan for you. I didn't ask anything of you. You made a choice, and it revealed something I thought the world had forgotten." She stood abruptly. "So what now?" she asked. "You tell me I passed some moral test, and then what? You give me a check, offer me a job, a car. I offer you nothing," he said, "unless you choose to hear me out." She stared at him, conflicted, curious, angry, moved. He stepped closer to the window. "I wasn't testing people," he said. "I was searching for something, and maybe someone." Then he turned back to her. "Would you have a coffee with me again? No conditions, no assumptions, just that. Just a question." She looked at him, not the suit, not the view, not the wealth, just the eyes. The same eyes that had looked at her from beneath dripping hair and shame. And she whispered, "Maybe." He smiled. And that right there was the beginning of something neither of them had words for. Not yet. Not love. Not fate. Something quieter. Something braver. And it was only just beginning. The train station platform buzzed with movement, rolling luggage, shuffling boots, passengers speaking in hushed voices, muffled beneath scarves, and the cold breath of morning. Hannah stood still, not frozen, not unsure, just still. The train bound for Montreal hissed as it pulled into the station, brakes sighing against metal tracks. She clutched her bag close to her side, one worn duffel, packed with 2 changes of clothes, a notebook, and the courage she hadn't realized she'd been carrying all along. She hadn't said yes to luxury. She hadn't agreed to promises or possibilities. All she said yes to was coffee. conversation, a second chance to understand something that had unsettled her in the best kind of way. Mason was already seated when she boarded. There were no assistants, no champagne flutes, no performance. Just him in a navy peacoat, a book in his lap, and 2 paper cups of coffee sitting between them. He looked up as she entered, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke. "I didn't think you'd come," he said. "I didn't think I would either," she replied. But she had remembered something important, something quiet, but undeniable. The world doesn't change unless you walk into it. They didn't talk about the hotel, or about money, or her fear of feeling small beside someone who had everything. Instead, they talked about cities they'd never seen, about how music could change the taste of silence, about kindness, and the way it always seemed to bloom in the cracks of broken places. They didn't know it then, but the train wasn't carrying them into romance. It was carrying them into truth. For the next 2 months, Hannah traveled in ways she'd never imagined. Not in jets, not in yachts, in borrowed trucks, in crowded buses, on back roads and river ferries. She followed Mason not into his world of glass towers and private clubs, but into the world he had chosen after losing everything he thought he was. They stayed in guest houses where the beds creaked and the heaters rattled, ate in school kitchens and community halls. They visited shelters and orphanages, places where people didn't know his name, only that he showed up year after year with books, with questions, with nothing to prove. He never introduced himself as anyone important, never arrived with cameras or speeches. He just listened. He remembered birthdays, favorite authors, the name of a child's lost dog, and Hannah watched it all. There was no performance in Mason, no hunger to impress. What she saw was not a billionaire stripped of luxury. She saw a man rediscovering his soul through the simplest of things. Once, while sorting clothing donations in a food bank in rural Vermont, Hannah finally asked him, "Why don't you tell people who you are?" He shrugged, "Because then they stop talking to me like I'm human." Somewhere in Quebec, deep in a pine-scented valley, where the snow sat like silence on every rooftop, they stayed in a cabin with no electricity. A single lantern lit the porch. The night was still. Crickets clicked softly in the dark. They sat with mugs of tea in hand, wool blankets pulled around their shoulders. It was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that felt awkward. It was the kind that felt like a breath finally exhaled. Then Mason spoke. "I've had people offer me everything," he said. "Comfort, control, even love. But I don't need someone to love me. I need someone who understands why I love the things I do." He looked over at her, voice softer now. "Someone who doesn't need to be dazzled, just present." Hannah didn't respond right away. She let the words breathe, then finally said, "I don't know if I'm that person. I don't know all the reasons why you are who you are." She paused. "But I do know this. I've never felt more like myself than I do when I'm around you." Mason didn't smile. He didn't respond with triumph. He He simply looked at her like someone who had just heard the answer he hadn't known he'd been waiting for. They didn't touch. They didn't move closer, because what they were building wasn't based on proximity. It was being built in the pauses, in the breath between words, in the way they saw each other when no one else was watching. One evening, back in the city, after visiting a shelter for women who had escaped violence, Mason took her to a rooftop, not a penthouse, a converted church with a view of the skyline, glowing against the dark like possibility. He handed her a folder. No ribbon, no logo, just a plain folder. Inside were documents for the creation of a foundation. In her name, the Hannah Clark Opportunity Fund. She looked up, unsure. "I want to leave something behind," he said, "but not in my name. That's been done. I want the next girl, the one serving coffee, taking care of her brother, wondering if anyone sees her. I want her to know someone did." Hannah didn't speak. "Not yet," he continued. "You don't have to run it. You don't even have to stay involved. But it'll exist because you did." She placed the folder gently on the table, her fingers resting on the edge. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything," he replied. But she did. She took a breath. "I'm honored, more than I can explain, but I want to try something different." He waited. "I want to build something, not with your name, not with mine, from the ground up, with my hands, not your legacy." Mason's eyes didn't narrow. They glowed. He nodded. "That's what makes you different," he said. And Hannah understood something then. This wasn't a test. It had never been a test. It was an invitation, not into wealth, but into belonging. The kind built not with inheritance, but with intention. Weeks passed, then months, and somewhere between the villages and the volunteer kitchens, between the shelter visits and the bus stop conversations, Hannah began to change. Not outwardly. Her shoes were still scuffed, her coat still secondhand, but her posture had shifted. She spoke more slowly, walked more intentionally. She no longer needed to explain her worth. She knew it. And Mason saw it too. He never tried to name what they were, never reached for labels, because what they shared lived deeper than definitions. They were not lovers, not business partners, not saviors. They were two people, shaped by loss, defined by kindness, connected by choice. And that, more than any title, was enough. Later that season, just before snow began to soften the sidewalks, Mason sat beside Hannah at a small local concert. She had helped organize it, a fundraiser for a literacy program. She'd started with nothing but paper flyers and community volunteers. The music rose softly around them, and as children read aloud from dog-eared library books, Hannah leaned close and whispered, "I don't think I was ever supposed to find you." Mason turned, smiling gently. "But maybe we weren't supposed to find anything," he said. "Maybe we were just supposed to become." She nodded, and in that moment, under the fairy lights strung across folding chairs and borrowed amps, she realized something. The world hadn't changed, but she had. And maybe, just maybe, that was how change really began. It was early spring when Hannah returned to the city, not because she was lost, not because she needed to, but because she was ready. She stepped off the bus with the same worn duffel, the same quiet resolve. The streets were familiar, cracked sidewalks, corner stores, the muted hum of traffic, but she was not the same girl who had walked them before. Something inside her had rooted, not confidence, not pride, clarity. She didn't call Mason. She didn't need to. Instead, she walked back to the same street corner where the rain had first brought a stranger into her life. The coffee shop was still there, but something about it felt hollow now, like the warmth had been drained from its walls. It had been sold. New owners, new name, new rules. Hannah stood across the street for a long time, just watching. She didn't miss working there. She missed what it had once stood for. A single moment of courage, a small act of care. That was all it had taken to change the direction of her life. And now she wanted to give that chance back, not in someone else's space, in her own. It took weeks, countless calls, meetings in noisy cafes, notes scribbled on napkins, nights spent sketching floor plans by flashlight while Caleb slept on the other side of their small apartment. She didn't have wealth, but she had people. People who believed in her, even if they didn't fully understand what she was building. Former customers who remembered her kindness. Strangers who had seen her in action. Volunteers who had worked beside her in shelters and schools, and knew she meant it when she said this was about more than coffee. There were small donations, anonymous ones, and one quiet envelope that arrived without a note, just a cashier's check and the initials MH in the corner. She never asked. She didn't need to. The building was old. The rent was low because the ceilings needed repair and the wiring moaned when the lights flickered on. But it had a large window, a brick wall exposed in the back, and to Hannah it felt like promise. She tore out the old floors herself, painted the walls with the help of 2 friends from the literacy program, built the bookshelves with borrowed tools and her own blistered hands. She didn't hang up photos of herself. She hung quotes from authors, from strangers, from people who had taught her the value of showing up. The name came easily. The first cup. It was more than just a nod to the coffee she'd once paid for. It was a reminder that the first step into warmth, the first seat offered without condition, the first cup given with no questions asked, could be the start of everything. On the glass door, in soft gold script, she had etched the words, "No one should have to earn kindness." Inside, there were no prices listed, just a chalkboard that read, "Your first cup is on us. Your second, if you can, on someone else." There was a piano in the corner, a basket of gloves by the door in winter, a shelf of donated books near the counter, each with a note inside. "Take me, return me, or don't, just read." Each table bore not a number, but a word. Hope, begin, rest, listen. Opening day arrived quietly. There was no press, no fanfare, just a slow trickle of people who had heard about the Kindness Cafe and were curious to see if it was real. It was. A nurse came in after a double shift, her scrubs wrinkled, her eyes tired. A young man delivered packages for a courier service, soaked from the rain. A mother with 2 children asked if she could just sit for a moment. No drinks, just space. Hannah smiled and said what she had waited so long to say. Of course, here everyone belongs. Then it happened again. The door opened with the chime of an old bell. An older man stood in the entrance, his coat dripping wet, his posture uncertain. He looked hesitant, nervous. A new barista, just hired the week before, stepped forward and hesitated. Sir, this space is for customers only. If you don't. Hannah was already moving. She laid a hand gently on the barista's shoulder. It's okay, she said softly, then turned to the man. Would you like a seat by the window? He blinked, then nodded slowly. What would you like today? He glanced down, his voice barely above a whisper. Just something warm. It's been a long morning. She smiled. Then let's make it longer with a little peace. She turned to the barista. Here, the first cup is always on us. No questions, no shame. Later, during the soft opening event, Hannah stood beside the piano, holding a microphone in one hand and a warm cup in the other. The cafe was full. Conversations hummed like a low song. She took a breath. Years ago, she began, I paid for someone's coffee. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know what would come of it. I just saw someone being made small, and I couldn't look away. She paused. That cup cost me $5, but it gave me something worth far more, a new way to see the world, and a new way to see myself. People nodded. Some wiped their eyes. I thought I was helping a man who was lost, but it turns out he helped me find the version of myself I didn't know I was allowed to become. She smiled gently. This cafe isn't about selling coffee. It's about presence, about showing up when no one else does, about kindness that doesn't need to be remembered, only continued. She set the cup down on the piano. And some lives, she added softly, don't change through love stories or miracles, but through a single, ordinary act of compassion given quietly and meant completely. The room was still. Then applause rose, not loud, not dramatic, but warm, sustained, real. And somewhere in the back of the cafe, someone poured a first cup for a man who didn't know he needed it until he did. Across the street, under the soft rain, stood Mason. He didn't wave. He didn't come in. He simply watched. His umbrella tilted just slightly as he looked through the cafe window and saw Hannah move among the guests like light. A smile touched his face, not of pride, not of ownership, but of peace. He turned and walked away, not because it was over, but because he didn't need to be there to know. She had arrived. The weeks passed slowly, like leaves falling in early autumn one by one, with purpose and grace. The first cup became more than a cafe. It became a shelter, even when it had no beds. A gathering place even when no events were planned. A sanctuary, not because it was grand, but because it was honest. And Hannah, she didn't transform into someone else. She simply became more of who she had always been. She was up before sunrise most days, wiping down tables, prepping muffins from scratch when she could afford the ingredients, accepting hand-me-down furniture from neighbors who just wanted to be part of something good. She greeted each guest like they mattered, because they did. Word spread quietly. A delivery driver who came in once on a rainy afternoon brought his sister the next week. A teacher began grading papers in the corner, then started tutoring 2 teens from the neighborhood. Someone left behind a book with a $10 bill tucked inside. A note on the bill said, "For the next first cup." The ripple was slow, but it was steady. One morning, as she was restocking napkins near the counter, a girl no older than 15 stood frozen by the front door. She wore a school uniform and carried a backpack that looked too heavy for her frame. Her eyes darted around the room, uncertain. Hannah walked over, slow and gentle. "Hey," she said. "First time here." The girl nodded. "Come in," Hannah smiled. "You're safe here." The girl stepped forward, one cautious step at a time. She sat at the begin table, ordered nothing, said even less. So Hannah brought her a warm cocoa and a slice of bread. No bill, no explanation. The girl ate in silence. Before leaving, she slipped Hannah a folded note. It read, "I was going to skip school today. I didn't know where to go. Then I remembered someone said this place felt like breathing. Thank you. I needed to breathe." Hannah held the note to her chest for a long moment before tucking it into her journal. She never learned the girl's name, but she never forgot her face. Caleb turned 17 that fall. He was taller now. His cough had faded. He worked part-time at a bookshop after school and still helped Hannah repaint the cafe walls whenever the scuffs grew too bold to ignore. One night, while they closed up together, he said, "You've made something real, you know." Hannah smiled without turning. "I just made coffee." "No," Caleb replied. "You made a place where people matter again." She blinked at that, and in her heart she felt it, the weight of being seen. One evening, as she locked the front door, she noticed a man standing at the corner across the street. It wasn't Mason, but it reminded her of him. The way he stood, not like he was waiting for someone, but like he was remembering something. And just for a second, she wondered where Mason was, if he was still visiting places where no one knew his name, if he still carried her in some quiet part of his journey, the way she carried him in hers. He had never come back to the cafe, not officially, not publicly, but once she'd found a book left behind on table rest, a first edition, worn at the edges, with a small card tucked inside. It read, "No promises, no plans, but always in your corner." That was enough. The foundation documents Mason had once offered sat in a drawer, untouched. Hannah never filed them, not because she didn't believe in the mission, but because she believed in starting with presence, not paperwork. She built her own programs instead, small grants for young adults aging out of the system, evening literacy circles, weekend meals where nobody asked if you could pay, no names carved on plaques, no ribbons cut with scissors, just real people doing small things with full hearts. And that, she believed, was what legacy should look like. 3 years later, the first cup had grown, not into a chain, not into a franchise, but into a movement. Other cafes began adapting the first cup-free model. Some schools added kindness corners, inspired by her story. A university professor wrote a research paper titled "The Power of Untransactional Spaces," citing her work without her even knowing. She never chased any of it. She just kept showing up, because that's what she'd always done, because that's what someone had once done for her. On the 5th anniversary of the cafe, she stood before a full room. She wasn't holding a microphone. She wasn't on a stage. She simply stood behind the counter, hand on a coffee pot, eyes filled with light. Someone called out from the back, "Tell us how it started again." She looked around, saw the nurse from year 1, the girl who once needed to breathe, her brother, a dozen new faces, all waiting. So she spoke, quiet and steady. It started with a man, wet, embarrassed, invisible, and me with $5 in my pocket and just enough heart left to use it. She paused. I didn't know who he was. I didn't care. I just knew I couldn't be another person who looked away. Another pause. That coffee didn't change the world, but it changed mine. And maybe that was enough. That night, as the cafe emptied and Caleb turned off the last lamp, Hannah sat by the window with a journal in her lap. She flipped through pages, read old notes, folded letters, scribbles, quotes. One line caught her eye again. Some loves don't need romance. Some lives change with nothing more than a kind gesture and the courage to mean it. She closed the book, stepped outside. Rain had started to fall, gentle, familiar. She lifted her face into it. No umbrella, no rush, just the sky, the streetlights, and the feeling that somewhere, maybe far away, maybe nearby, someone else had chosen kindness that day because she once had. And maybe they'd pass it on, and maybe someone else would too, and maybe that would be enough. Because legacies don't always wear gold seals or bear marble names.